Hi, everyone. Good evening to everyone as we join. Welcome on this beautiful warm night, if you're here in Vermont and probably elsewhere as well. Hi, my name is Kelly Smith. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a member of the Friends of Missisquoi National Wildlife Refuge. Thank you all for joining us this evening for the Phenology of Terrestrial Invasives. I'd like to quickly introduce you to the Friends group in case you're not quite familiar with what we do. So basically, we are a nonprofit that supports the Missisquoi National Wildlife Refuge up in northern Vermont in Swan in whatever way we can. So for example, we work to promote the refuge through educational outreach and by hosting events such as this. We conduct monthly bird walks on the refuge, which you are always welcome to join. We also donate funds to support education on the refuge, particularly to school age groups, and we do a lot of work to get grant funding in order to support those various efforts and projects taking place. We then work closely with the refuge manager, Ken Sturm, in providing assistance that might be helpful for the operation of the refuge. We are always looking for new members to get involved, and we would love to have you join if you're interested in supporting the work of the Friends group. You can sign up right on our website. As I mentioned, we do love to host fun events and we have them throughout the year. There are a lot of ones coming up right now. It's a popular time. So all of the information on our events can be found at the link that will be in the chat under the calendar tab. So you can find those very easily. And I highly recommend heading there and checking them out yourself. So definitely check out those events, get on up to the refuge. We'd love to have you and see how you get involved. And before we get started, I wanted to read the refuge's abbreviated land acknowledgement out loud. And while we're not physically gathered at the refuge today in person, I do hope that you'll join me in thinking of that land and space while we read this acknowledgement. The lands and waters of the Missisquoi National Wildlife Refuge are a very special place to those who make it their home. And we, as the current stewards of this area, recognize our responsibilities in caring for these lands and waters. We recognize that these lands and waters are also important to the Abnaki Nation of Missisquoi, the previous caretakers of this land. We are grateful to them and their ancestors for caring for this land and its surrounding waters for thousands of years. We understand the importance of this land in the Indigenous heritage of the region and to the Abnaki, present and past. We recognize the hardships and suffering these families endured when they were pushed out of their traditional ancestral lands as European colonization took hold. And we acknowledge their agony and despair when their access to the Delta for subsistence was ended by the creation of this wildlife refuge. We invite our visitors to share in honoring this Abnaki home by engaging in mindfulness while enjoying the refuge lands and waters and by holding the space with care and appreciation. Thank you. And now I'm thrilled to introduce Elizabeth Spinney, the Invasive Plant Project Coordinator with the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. And Elizabeth is joined by her colleague Samantha Brewer, the Volunteer Engagement Coordinator with the National Phenology Network. So I'm pleased to hand it off to Elizabeth and Samantha.
Hello. Thank you all so much for taking time today, especially on such a warm, lovely day, to join us for this last in the series on invasive species in Vermont, hosted by the Friends of Missisquoi National Wildlife Refuge. I hope our time together in the next hour will instill a sense that we can all have a positive impact and make a difference in caring for and being part of the natural world around us. Oh boy, that view to me is always worth the wait. Thanks so much, Rich. So like I said, tonight we're going to talk about invasive plant phenology in Vermont. Next slide. So just a little bit more. So my name is Elizabeth Spinney. I use she, her pronouns, and my job title is Invasive Plant Project Coordinator for Vermont Forest, Parks, and Recreation. This state government department is focused on protecting the forested natural resources of our state and in preserving the ability for all of us to connect with nature through state parks and other recreational opportunities. So pictured here is me and my colleague, Lena, who make up the entirety of our department's staff dedicated specifically to thinking about terrestrial invasive plants. And I'm the one with the goofy grin and the sunglasses. So our focus, therefore, is on amplifying our efforts through empowering others to action, whether that be our colleagues, other state government programs, land stewards, communities, or individuals. Invasive plant management is, I've learned, it's multifaceted. It's a process, not an event. And as any of you that have thought about or managed for invasive plants can attest, and our job is to take on a small part of this bigger work and guide the collective us through this process with resources on vtinvasives.org and running research projects like I'll share with you later on. And so when I'm not thinking about invasive plants, I'm likely out birding or hiking close to home or volunteering. I'm a volunteer and board member for the Birds of Vermont Museum and the Green Mountain Audubon Society. So tonight I am wearing the hat of the Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation. Also, pictured here, my superpower is getting birds and insects to land in my hands. And as Kelly said, I'm joined today by my colleague Samantha, who is the Volunteer Engagement Coordinator for the National Phenology Network. I don't know, Sam, if you want to jump in now or do intros later.
Jump in now. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. My name is Samantha Brewer. I'm the Volunteer Engagement Coordinator for the USA National Phenology Network, and I've worked with Elizabeth and her projects with invasive plant species, and so I'm excited to be here also to tell you guys about ways that you can participate in collecting phenology data for researchers to be able to learn more about the plants in your area.
We're so grateful to have you with us today, Sam. Next slide, thank you. So I'll share the story of invasive plants in Vermont, the program I'm part of and what we've accomplished, and why our work is pivoting to include phenology monitoring and how you can help. And my colleague and friend Samantha will share, like she said, about the National Phenology Network and how community scientists across the country, like me and you, are providing real and helpful data to researchers. Next slide. My program perspective on this bigger forest health issue of invasive plants will be, at least somewhat, different than your own. How we each see and perceive the world around us can be different. If we just think about like left right eye dominance, we can be looking at the same thing at the same time and experience it differently. For me, perspective is so important to bring to the forefront in discussions around topics like invasive species and climate change, and use it as a reminder that we're all likely working towards a shared goal, just coming along different paths carved by perspective. What defines an invasive plant, at least for our program, is twofold. So it must have evolved elsewhere to where you find it, and it must be causing some kind of defined harm to things that we place value on. So like the environment, the economy, or human health. And not all introduced plants are invasive, and some of our locally evolved plants can even be invasive if introduced outside of their ranges. An important perspective that our staff try to share is to remember that we should avoid assigning intent. So these are plants, like they're just that, they're plants. They ultimately are growing and being plants and doing plant things. And they got to where they are because they were transported by humans. The plants themselves are not inherently evil or bad. And the values that we say invasive plants impact are different today than in years past. We're all learning and growing and making changes to protect the things we value today. This perspective of what is valued has shifted over time. I mean, not long ago, we saw value in planting many of these plants in landscaping and even for conservation. But we didn't fully understand the consequences of our actions. Our values and perspective changed. Next slide. So another perspective I'd like to discuss is understanding the reality of where we are with invasive plants in Vermont. So I know this graph has a lot of words on it, but let's just focus on the curve that goes from left to right. This is called an invasion curve, and it's snagged right out of an invasion biology textbook. This graphically represents time and reasonable management goals along the bottom, and infestation size and cost of control on the vertical. Invasive plants are an issue for forest health as we understand it, in the way they displace locally evolved species, disrupt the local ecosystem, and leave forests more vulnerable to the threats of climate change. Managing invasive plants allows us to address all of those issues right now, using currently available tools and technology, and if done strategically, requires a relatively low investment of funding and time. The cheapest, easiest way to manage invasive plants is prevention or early detection, which you can see on the far left of this graph. On the right side, we see that well-established invasive plant populations, resource protection, and long-term management become our only options. Towards the center, with that little arrow, you can also see where public awareness of invasive plants typically begins. So we know from experience that many common species of invasive plants in Vermont fall into that far right section of the graph. This means that the goal for working with those plants isn't eradication, so much as it is prioritizing and then protecting the resources we value and trying to support ecosystem resiliency. And yet, even with those common species, there are still places in Vermont that are left of center, where eradication is still feasible. Rapid action, when possible, can help protect what we value and reduce spread, meaning that we're not too late to avoid long-lasting impacts. Regardless of where a place falls along this graph, the presence of introduced invasive plants at any concentration is reason for action. And so my hope, like I said earlier, is to instill in you a sense that we can still do something to provide protection for the things that we value, with the understanding that in many cases, we are talking about long-term stewardship and monitoring versus eradication. Next slide. So in Vermont, part of the story of changing perspectives about the impacts of our actions and moving towards correcting course starts in about the 70s or 80s, when the state enacted forest pest control laws and aquatic invasive species transport laws. If you've been tuning in to the previous presentations in this series hosted by the Friends of the Refuge, you may have already learned about some of those. But the impacts of terrestrial invasive plants have really only been of focused concern for about 2 to 3 decades. Attention was given to this issue in 2002, when the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets passed the noxious weed rule and created the Vermont Noxious Weed List. The rule covers both aquatic and terrestrial invasive plants, but it set the framework for efforts to address terrestrial invasive plants. However, there's no statute, there's no requirement to broadly address invasive plants. With no directive, no line in anyone's budget to specifically fund this work, it took the forward thinking of some of our fellow Vermonters to recognize invasive plants as an issue they were willing to confront and fund. So we see that the skills and knowledge needed to manage existing invasive plants and to identify and respond to new ones are present in abundance in Vermont, but dispersed among government agencies, private organizations, resource professionals, and concerned citizens. In Vermont, this issue doesn't belong to one person, one program, one constituency, or one agency. It's the collective actions of many that are making a difference. Next slide. So connecting back to perspective, as I said before, it wasn't that long ago that invasive plants were recognized as a widely accepted issue. This 1989 USDA catalog of conservation plants for the Northeast is a great illustration of that shift. The cover sports a flashy plant now known to be invasive, autumn olive. The pages of that catalog are filled with even more examples of plants where our perspective has shifted. The presence of invasive plants on the landscape can serve as a lasting reminder, kind of like this catalog, of humankind's ability to make mistakes. And stewardship, which happens when we protect and improve ecosystems, involves recognizing those mistakes, learning from them, and trying to fix some of the harm that's been done. Next slide. Part of Vermont's terrestrial invasive plant story involves me and my colleagues. And I want to recognize that there are many people who came before us and many who walk alongside us. But for today, I'll just speak of the work of my specific program. In 2013, the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation received a grant to support outreach and management of invasive plants on state stewarded public lands. These dedicated staff have been working with volunteers and other staff from across the government and fostering other novel partnerships across the state. And this has largely been the work of one grant-funded full-time staff and 1 to 2 seasonal staff and interns. Our program closed the books on this chapter of our work as of the middle of last year when our funding for that work ended. And don't worry, we have a new funding source, which I'll share about soon. And the tangible products of that grant are resources which are freely available on the vtinvasives.org website. The links are listed at the end of the slideshow, and I'll also make sure that the links are provided to our hosts to share with all of you. Next slide. So speaking of vtinvasives.org, raise your hand if you remember the old VT Invasives website, circa about 2013. We certainly do. It used to be a rabbit hole and was badly in need of updating. A big part of our work that carries over from old grant to new grant is continuing to update and upgrade this free resource. The website serves as a communication tool for people throughout Vermont and beyond about a variety of invasive taxa. In the last year alone, the website saw over 95,000 unique global visitors. And of those, 72,000 were from within the US, where 15,000 were Vermonters. And 23,000 were from outside the US, from countries like the Philippines, India, Canada, UK, Germany, Netherlands, Indonesia, and Spain. Next slide. And I just want to share again, though, that this is a collective effort. For every moment our small staff works towards solutions, there are 10 more moments made possible by dedicated, caring people across the state. Next slide. And so that brings me to where our work is headed. Our newest grant seeks to fill in significant knowledge gaps that are important for effective, large-scale management. So now we'll talk about invasive plant phenology. Next slide. So since 2013, when we got that first grant, our department has been experimenting with management techniques and lots of outreach through programs in parks and through the VT Invasives website. But through it all, it's become clear that there's a realized need in Vermont for a consistent statewide approach and science-based proactive management of terrestrial invasive plants. And while all this other work has been important in laying a sustainable foundation for efforts to come, there are obvious areas where we still need to grow. For instance, there is an absence of strong data on the phenologies of terrestrial invasive plants in northern New England and in Vermont. Phenology is the study of the timing of seasonal changes in living things. And the lack of relevant information is part of what's limiting Vermont's capacity to manage terrestrial invasive plants effectively, especially going forward. So when people ask us when something's flowering or when to time treatments, we honestly don't know because that data hasn't been previously recorded. And research is emerging, showing climate change shifting the effectiveness and timing of traditional terrestrial invasive plant management, which will impact how state lands are managed, as well as how communities and landowners plan, budget, and implement terrestrial invasive plant control efforts themselves. Establishing a baseline data set, as well as establishing projects for the ongoing collection of this data is important and timely. The Vermont Invasive Phenology Network, aka our program, is currently leading 2 phenology monitoring projects, each with a different focus and volunteer involvement levels. Next slide. To make this new grant a reality, we're partnering with so many great organizations. A major project partner has been the National Phenology Network, who Samantha works for. As I mentioned just before, these projects have been designed to establish a baseline data set for invasive plant phenology in Vermont. So we'll theoretically be able to track phenological shifts that occurred due to climate change and use the data in real time to help plan for and manage invasive plants effectively. And now I'll turn it over to Samantha to tell us more about National Phenology Network, their project Nature's Notebook, and about the variety of community science projects you can take part in that support research in Northern New England.
Hello, thank you so much. I appreciate that. And thank you all for joining with me today. I don't remember, Elizabeth, how long we've been working together, but I feel like it's been over a year at least. So
directly, at least, yeah. I think we were, oh boy, even like 2019, we were communicating with NPN. But
oh, that's awesome. Yeah, that's great. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Oh, but I've got 2. I think if I do it this way, and then I can, oops, always do it. There we go. And then, all right. Can you guys see like the regular version? I can never remember if it will actually pop up the regular one or the notes version.
We see your presenter mode.
Perfect. Okay, excellent.
Oh, no, sorry. Like we see like the view that you see as the presenter.
Oh, okay. So that is, let me stop my sharing. I'll just do it again, and that's fine. I think now, there we go. There we go. That one's got it.
Perfection.
Thank you. I never have gotten used to the 2 screens. But yeah, we've been working with Elizabeth for a while. And we've been working actually there was a project that was done around that area with the pesky plant trackers, where volunteers were were helping collect data on Japanese knotweed and Bohemian knotweed. And I think there was one other one with the pesky plant trackers. It was
wild parsnip.
Yes, thank you. The wild parsnip. The wild parsnip. Volunteers are collecting that data with Nature's Notebook so that researchers can learn more about what's going on with the phenology of the plants in that area. And we would get that question like a lot. I'm glad that Elizabeth mentioned like the plants are not inherently evil, right? Like part of learning about them is not just destroying them the moment you see them, but actually taking the time to observe them and learn from them so that we can be able to manage them most effectively. So part of how like living with these invasives and them being a part of our environment is learning how they work and learning about their phenology so that we can learn how to live with them and learn how to manage them appropriately and effectively. One of the ways that you can record that data or participate in that kind of scientific research is through our program, Nature's Notebook. So I like to do a brief land acknowledgement as well. I'm joining you all from Tucson, Arizona. And so here in Tucson, this is the traditional ancestral homeland of the Tohono O'odham, O'odham Jude, Sovaipuri, and Hohokam peoples, past and present, who have been stewards of this land for thousands of years and remain stewards of this land today. So we appreciate and value the work that they do with the land and the care that they put into the land here. All right, so we've said that word phenology a lot, and I know Elizabeth's mentioned it as well, but what is phenology, right? And phenology is kind of fun because it's one of those words that no one seems to know what it means until you work with it for a long time, but everyone really gets the concept. So what phenology is it's an ology, right? So it's the study of, and it's the study of the seasonal changes of plants and animals in their habitat, right? So with biology, you're studying living things. And with ecology, you're studying living things in their environment. And so with phenology, you're looking at living things, their environment, their climate, and how it changes through time cyclically and annually. So every year, you know, the earth rotates and tilts on its axis, and that affects the climate of an area, and that affects, you know, the ways that plants and animals are adapted to that area to be able to adapt to those seasonal changes. It's one of the simplest processes in which to track changes in ecology of species in response to climate change. So as climates change, right, the climate changes, the way that plants and animals respond to those changes is going to be important for us to understand as we would move forward and through, you know, the next decades or centuries or X amount of time. And there's many applications of phenology, right? It's not just that you're studying it to just like, oh, like it's really interesting of what's going on in the natural world around us. But there's a lot of really important practical applications to phenology as well. For example, fire management, understanding seasonal patterns of plants and animals and how that could be affected or how they're adapted to different fire regimes. When you think about invasive insects, right? The phenology of invasive insects, how they affect the plants, when insects might be emerging at certain times of year. And this plant right here in the corner, this is an invasive down here in Tucson. It's called bufflegrass. So bufflegrass is a plant that has impacted the way patterns of wildfires work in Arizona. And with bufflegrass here in Arizona, a lot of our plant phenology or a lot of our plants depend on water. And so when it rains, the bufflegrass will green up and it'll hit a certain sweet spot where it's most effective to use herbicide treatments against it during that time. Other applications of phenology include knowing when there's nectar available for nectaring species of animals. It's important for understanding crops and patterns in crops, and even with allergies. So seasonal allergies, as the climate changes, if it gets warmer for longer periods of time, we can expect longer allergy seasons. So there can be major impacts on human health as well. And so then what drives phenology, right? What is actually, you know, what causes these seasonal changes in the plants and animals? And it's basically the climate and other abiotic factors in their environment that are what drive these seasonal patterns. So in the wintertime, when it's really cold in some places, right, you'll have plants that it's better for them to go dormant during those times. And then when it's warm for a certain number of days for a certain period of time, you'll see plants will get those cues from their environment that it's safe to warm up, it's safe for them to sprout their leaves or produce flowers. And then once they've done that, then they can kind of grow in development. They can collect a lot of energy in the summertime. And eventually in the fall, when the temperature gets colder, many of these plants will lose their leaves and become dormant again in the winter. And then those cycles will continue. So yeah, once again, phenology is those recurring plant and animal life cycle stages and their relationships with climate and other abiotic factors as well. But there can be shifts in phenology, right? So if there's shifts in climates, you can see shifts in when plants and animals will get these seasonal cues for when to put out their flowers or when to produce fruits, or even when to begin rearing nestlings. So for example, this is an example of a bird where its seasonal timing is dependent on the abundance of caterpillars. So when you're a bird and you're flying up north for migration, you're migrating north for the breeding season. You're going to come up, you're going to build a nest, you're going to lay eggs, and then eventually those eggs are going to hatch and you're going to have to feed all those little open baby bird mouths. And many birds will rely on the abundance of caterpillars, so caterpillars being available when those baby birds are. So with the seasonal timing of some of these bird migrations, they'll arrive for their migrations before the caterpillars arrive, they'll lay their eggs. And the timing of when they arrive and when they lay their eggs all depend on the timing of there will be peak caterpillar abundance when the babies hatch, so they have as much food as possible for those babies. If they arrive too early, you don't have enough caterpillars. And then if you arrive too late as well, you wouldn't have enough caterpillars. So they have, for a long, long time, they've adapted for the timing of the caterpillars to match the timing of when their nestlings are there. But if there's a shift, where the area where the birds migrate north, if there's a shift where the trees are leafing out earlier because it's getting warmer earlier in the season, then those moths or butterflies may lay eggs earlier, which then will hatch the caterpillars earlier. And then that caterpillar abundance then will shift, not when there's nestlings, but when they're laying eggs. That's when the birds don't need the caterpillars, right? The birds need them during this nestly time. So then if you have a shift, you may have an incident where the bird will shift as well. The birds will start arriving earlier to try to match with the caterpillars, but you could also get what's known as a phenological mismatch, where now the birds have not shifted the timing of when they arrive, but now there's no nestlings or there's no caterpillars when their nestlings have hatched. So that's known as a phenological mismatch. So what can you do about this, right? That's huge, like global issues that are happening. And so like what as individuals can like do about this, right? But one way that you can actually help us better understand phenology and better understand if phenological shifts are happening, or better understand there's new invasive plants or invasive plants that have been here for a long time, and how is their phenology affecting other plants and animals in our ecosystems, is by volunteering or participating in volunteer science. There's a lot of terms for volunteer science, which many of you may have heard of, such as citizen science, crowdsourced science, civic monitoring, volunteer monitoring, network science, participating science, community science, I hear more and more often, and now tracking science, right? So if it's anything where people who may or may not have a background in scientific research can actually participate, get with minimal training, and be able to contribute data and to increase our collective scientific knowledge of what's going on around us. And there's a huge history of volunteer science that happens. Many early naturalists, when in the United States, were untrained in scientists, right? They're just out exploring, collecting data, writing notes, and just getting baseline learning about what's going on in this country that they arrived at. The term for volunteer science or citizen science first entered in the Oxford English Dictionary in 2014. And there's been great increases in the amount of citizen science or volunteer science opportunities that increased since about the 1990s. So in the chat, I'm gonna have you guys wake up a little bit and like flex your little keyboard fingers. But I want to see in the chat, why do you think there's been a huge increase in programs that average citizens or average members of community can participate in citizen science program? Like what happened in the 90s to make this more widely available to anybody? I'm gonna give you guys a moment in the chat to like, oh, she's actually asking us a question. But why do you think there's been more availability for citizen science starting around in the 90s? Digital, right? Cell phones. There's the word I was looking for, the internet, right? Even before we all got cell phones. I remember in middle school, my friends had beepers. I still remember this. But in the 90s, we had the internet. And so you were able to communicate and share information much more easily. It's not like you had to put in a paper data sheet and put it in the mail, right? You could actually go online, learn about projects, and be able to more quickly and efficiently participate in those projects. And this is really great because especially with phenology, and when you think about climate change, it's not something that happens overnight, right? It's something that happens over a long period of time, and you can get variations in years. And so when you're trying to find these major patterns, it's really important to have long-term data available. So one example is Henry David Thoreau's observations of flowering plants that he recorded in his journals have been actually compared to the same species at Walden Pond in recent years. And I believe this was his daughter was still collecting data at Walden Pond. So you had like several decades of research. And some of the information they found was that on average, for example, sandhill cranes and geese were arriving earlier over 61 years than they had been previously arrived. So when you're actually like collecting data for a long period of time, you can make these comparisons and see when phenological shifts are actually happening, because it takes a long time for those shifts to occur. Another important aspect of volunteer science. So for the Audubon Christmas bird count is a volunteer science opportunity that's been going on for many, many decades. And this is just some cool findings from that. So with the Christmas bird count, it's like anybody can participate. You have birders from all across the United States that come and participate and enter information about the birds that they see in their area. And one thing that they found was when you look at bird centers of abundance, is they actually have seen over time that the centers of abundance for some of these bird species have actually been moving north in more recent years, which makes sense, because if you're thinking about temperature change and climate change and areas getting warmer, if they have a preferred kind of area of what they want to be temperature-wise, you're going to see shifts in latitudes as you see things get warmer. And there's increasing prevalence in volunteer science as well. So this is a cool study. It's even a little out of date because it's from 2014, but this is just showing the dramatic growth between 1997 and 2014 in publications that have featured volunteer science. And so with Nature's Notebook and the USA National Phenology Network, I'm from the Phenology Network, where we kind of manage and store the data that's collected through Nature's Notebook, but Nature's Notebook is our citizen science program. And there have been over 100 peer-reviewed publications published featuring data that was collected by volunteers through Nature's Notebook. So it's just showing that the data that's collected by volunteers is extremely important, even if you don't have a major science background, but it's valuable enough where peer reviewers are actually able to read those publications and say, like, yes, this is quality data, and we are able to learn from this and be able to use it in a scientific manner. And there's lots of different options for phenology and volunteer science. There's like hundreds and hundreds of different citizen science and volunteer science opportunities out there, but many of you probably heard of iNaturalist before. iNaturalist is a great way to be able to collect volunteer science data. Project Budburst is another program that uses phenology to collect data, and of course, Nature's Notebook. Journey North is a great volunteer science program that looks at monarch butterflies. And then SciStarter is just a great one. Even if you're like, oh, this is neat, but phenology is not quite my thing. SciStarter has just a huge database of available citizen science and volunteer science programs that you can learn about and participate in if you'd like. So once again, yeah, I'm from the National Phenology Network. So that was a little bit about phenology and citizen science. And so here at the National Phenology Network, we are kind of the stewards of the phenology data that's collected through Nature's Notebook. We collect, store, share phenology data and information to help land managers make informed decisions, be able to advance scientific knowledge, communicating and connecting with the people around us, and then also creating an equitable and inclusive network are kind of like the main foundation for our organization. And so our citizen science program is called Nature's Notebook, where volunteer scientists are able to collect data on phenology across the United States. Currently, we have over 24,700 active observers through the United States who collect phenology data through Nature's Notebook at 18,500 active sites, and over 30 million phenology records have been collected with volunteers using Nature's Notebook. And there's two major ways that people are able to participate. You can start or join a local phenology program that's near you. A local phenology program is an area where you might have a volunteer coordinator, but you have someone who has volunteers who brings people in to collect phenology data. But you can also just open the Nature's Notebook app. You can actually create a site in your own backyard or another local area near you where you can actually collect your own data. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how Nature's Notebook works and how you could create a site and start collecting Nature's Notebook data. And essentially, the way Nature's Notebook works and the way that you can collect phenology data is you're reporting on what you see by answering yes or no questions about the data that are available. So here in Arizona, this is a plant. Actually, it's funny because I have a lot of Arizona plant slides. This looks totally different than what you guys have, but let's see if you guys could guess what major group of plants, and bonus points if you know that caterpillar, if you want to put it in the chat. What kind of group of plants do you think this is? And which caterpillar maybe do you guys think that is? Yes, that is a monarch caterpillar. Thank you. It is. It's a monarch caterpillar. You can tell because it has these very distinct black and white stripes, and it's got, well, you can't see a third, but it's got kind of two pairs. There's another pair of filaments in the back here, but this is a monarch. So this is, yep. So therefore this is on a milkweed plant. This is a pine leaf milkweed. The milkweeds here in Arizona have teeny tiny little thin leaves because our plants are adapted where they actually don't want to get hit with too much sunlight because it's so dry here. They want to conserve water. So they're all adapted to have these really thin leaves to prevent water loss. But this is a pine leaf milkweed. And so if I was out collecting data for Nature's Notebook, I would answer yes or no questions to what I'm seeing in the phenology. So plant phenology can include things like leaves, flowers, and fruits. So in this case, I would say, oh, I'm collecting my data. I see flowers on this milkweed. So I would say, yes, I see flowers. I don't see any fruits, so I would say no, I don't see any fruits, but I would say yes, I do see leaves on my milkweed. And same with the monarch, you can record phenology on animals as well, right? So you can say if there's adult monarchs, if they're laying eggs, if you see pupa or caterpillars. So I would also record, yes, I see a monarch pupa, but no, I don't see any monarch adults. But it's for one thing for me to say like, oh, look, here's a milkweed, right? Do you see leaves? Do you see flowers? Do you see fruits? But different plants work differently in all sorts of different parts of the country, and different groups of plants work differently. So we have very specific protocols that you can learn to define like what is a leaf on this plant, or what is a flower or a flower bud or an open flower, and even fruits or ripe fruits. You can actually differentiate on your specific plants by reading up on the protocols. So in Nature's Notebook, I would create a study site where I have my plants. In this case, I have my milkweeds, and I would enter. I am observing. This is another milkweed. Believe it or not, this is a rush or desert milkweed. There's the little milkweed flowers up there. But I would include my desert milkweed, and then every time I go out there, I would say, do I see leaves on my milkweed? This one you don't. They have very little leaves, usually early in the springtime. But I do see flowers. I do see open flowers. And I see fruits. Here's a milkweed fruit, but they're not split open. So I would say no for ripe fruits, and I would say no for fruit or seed drop as well. But you can look at the protocols to determine what stages of phenology you're seeing present on your plants and your animals. And it's the same thing for butterflies, right? So once again, we have that monarch butterfly. And you can say, like, do I see adults feeding? Yes or no? Do I see them visiting a flower? Are they migrating? Are they mating or laying eggs? So you can record what you're observing your butterfly doing. And you can observe it for whatever amount of time, 10 minutes or 15 minutes. And you might see several different phenophases, but you can also record how many minutes you're observing your animals as well. And they also have their own protocols for determining the different phenophases or different life stages for these plants or animals. For recording data with Nature's Notebook, once you have a Nature's Notebook account and you've added the plants and the animals that you want to observe, you can collect data using paper data sheets. So for some of you, it might be more convenient to have a paper data sheet that you can take out into the field, and then you can bring it back and enter the data on your computer. But we also have a mobile app where you can just enter the data on your app. It actually, you can use it even if you don't get good cell service, because then once you get to Wi-Fi, then you can upload the data or download the data into the database. But you have those two different options for being able to collect phenology data. So now we're going to try your own. So this, oh, what plant is this one? It looks kind of like an Arizona milkweed, but it's not quite an Arizona milkweed, but it is one of our desert milkweeds down here. But we're going to have you guys try it in the comments. So for this one, if I asked you for this milkweed, do you see leaves? Would you say yes or no for this one? Yeah, yes, I see leaves. I see leaves on the milkweed. How about flowers? Would you say yes or no to seeing flowers on this milkweed? Ah, see, yep, yes, I see flowers. Now, how about fruits? If there's some sort of seed pod on the milkweed, do you guys say yes or no to fruits on this milkweed? Yeah, that's exactly it. You would say no to fruits. And then on that case, too, like it would also be ripe fruits. I would say no to ripe fruits as well. Now, then for monarchs here, what would you say for seeing monarch caterpillars? Do you see monarch caterpillars, yes or no? Excellent. You see no, right? How about monarch adults? Do you see monarch adults, yes or no? Yep. Are they visiting flowers? Is this monarch visiting flowers? Oh, yeah, you guys are good, right? All of you, thank you for participating. I appreciate it. Right, so yes, you see them. And actually, you can even see that little proboscis out. So is this one actually feeding on the flowers, or is it just visiting? Is it feeding as well? Yes, it is. I won't ask you all of them, right? We can tell there's only one. It's not mating. It doesn't look like it. It doesn't seem to have that upturned abdomen, so it doesn't look like it's laying eggs to me. But I would say yes, that it's feeding and visiting flowers. And what's important with Nature's Notebook and being able to document this information as well is you can document information even when those flowers aren't open yet. So let's say you got a brand new milkweed, it's not flowering, you've just got leaves on it. You're reporting, oh, I'm at my milkweed. Yes, I see leaves. No, I don't see flowers. No, I don't see fruits. But if you go back next week, you say, yes, I see leaves. But now, yes, I see flowers too. So last week I didn't have any flowers. This week I do see flower buds. And what's cool is you're pinpointing when those flower buds appeared, because the data that you collect is tied to climate data. And so then resources managers, scientists can actually look at that climate data and say, like, nope, there were no flowers on these milkweeds at this time. There's flowers now, right? Or they've been reporting no for monarchs for the past few months. Now they're saying yes for monarchs. Now we're pinpointing when the monarchs arrived at that site. So that's what's cool about being able to observe the same plants year after year after year, is you're able to document how that plant has changed through time and when those changes occur in regards to climate around them. So it's like, that's really cool, right? I can document these flowers, but do scientists actually use this information? And I get asked that all the time. There are over 1,700 different plant and animal species available to observe with Nature's Notebook. And not all of them have specific things that researchers are looking for, right? So sometimes it might be, it's just that it's a plant in your backyard and you want to learn about phenology. You want to record that data, and maybe a scientist can use it in the future, because once again, even if no one's researching it now, 5 years from now, if a scientist is like, hey, I actually want to look at specifically some of these Arizona milkweed species and what there's going on with the monarchs, you're starting to get that long-term data that's available to them. We do have some researchers, though, who do fund specific campaigns, data collection campaigns. Pesky Plant Trackers was one of these campaigns, but that project was completed last year, and they're still working on like the data analysis part of that project. But these are cases where, yes, scientists are looking for specific information on specific species. And with those funded campaigns, we put out regular newsletters, letting people know what the data are showing, and so that you can sign up for those newsletters and see how the data that you're contributing is making a difference in what the scientists are able to learn from the data you're collecting as well. And we also put in like some top local phenology program participation as well, and we like to acknowledge all the different observers who are reporting those data as well. So I'm going to talk about a few data collection campaigns that are available in your guys' area. If you want to, you can get your phone. If you pull up your camera, you should be able to scan the QR code. So if this is a campaign that you're interested in, you can actually scan that QR code and sign up for the newsletters so that you can learn about what's going on with that campaign or what your data are finding. We put out those newsletters about every 6 weeks or so with updates, and sometimes it's like, hey, just so you know, some flowers might be blooming. But that's what those QR codes are for, is for signing up for those messages. But one campaign that we have available that researchers are looking at is called Nectar Connectors, and this is where it's for a campaign that's all over the United States, but we're looking at certain nectaring species and looking for where nectar is available for migrating pollinators, right? Because it's one thing when you've got flower buds on a plant, but pollinators and nectaring animals need those open flowers so that we can see when nectar is available for those species across the United States. If any of you are oak enthusiasts, or maybe you have an oak in your yard and would like to participate, you can also participate in our Quercus Quest campaign. For this campaign, researchers are trying to better understand the complexities of oaks through phenology. So they're looking at when they leaf out, they're looking at seed production and acorn production, and they're also looking at kind of the relationships of eastern oaks. And also some of the phenology that goes on with crossbreeding of those species, and even looking at phenology of some of the relationships of fungal communities with those species as well. Also, if any of you suffer from seasonal allergies, you may or may not want to participate in this one because it means like going outside and checking out the phenology. But with pollen trackers, researchers are trying to better understand the relationships between open flowers and pollen concentrations in the United States, and especially seeing with climate change and seeing some of these long spring seasons, seeing when, looking at when those flowers are open, and also what's going on with what's going on in the pollen in the air, and looking for those connections. With red buds, I hear you guys might have red buds kind of in some of the lower areas of your state, which is actually really cool. The Red Bud Phenology Project is learning about when Eastern and Western red buds flower and fruit. So especially when you're in one of those areas that's kind of at the edge of where they occur, that can be really useful information of better understanding the phenology of these plants. If you haven't heard of or seen a red bud before, try to find one. I found one on our campus here in Tucson and about lost my mind. They're so beautiful. So check out this program if you know of any red buds in your area, or if you're kind of in those southern edges where you might find them. But once again, the data collected through Nature's Notebook has been published in over 100 peer review papers. So the data that is collected is useful, that scientists are able to use. And invasive plants are one of those kind of subjects that there's a lot to learn about. This is another previous campaign that's come to a close, where they were looking at the invasive shrub leaf out, because this was called like the Shady Invaders campaign, because when you have earlier leaf out for non-native shrubs, it provides less light for some native species that might leaf out later because they're competing for that kind of sunlight space. So this is just kind of neat. It's showing the number of years different people were observing for those campaigns, or for this campaign, and where they're able to observe in the United States. And what they found, which is interesting, was based on latitude. The invasive shrubs were leafing out much earlier in the year at lower latitudes. There was a lot of overlap at the higher latitudes with later in the year, but they were definitely leafing out earlier than the native species in those lower latitudes. So yes, some people ask us as well, like, why isn't this listed as invasive? Because once again, it's not for us to put a judgment on the fact that the plant is a native or an invasive plant. And sometimes you don't want to have a bias where people won't observe a plant because they're like, oh, it's an invasive, like no one wants to know about that. Yes, we do want to know about what's going on with the invasive plants. It's incredibly important, especially for managers who need to learn how to manage these species. Knowing when they're going to flower can help us predict when they're going to fruit, so that you can do management before they seed out, for example. Depending on the plant and what the management recommendations are for that plant, knowing when it's going to be the most easiest and most effective ways to manage it is really, really important. And then also what's great about Nature's Notebook is we have this wonderful visualization tool where you can actually explore the data. So if you're looking at how your plants are comparing to other plants in the United States, you can check out data.usanpn.org/viz tool. There's seasonal stories on there where you can actually look at spring conditions, like I mentioned, like with plants, and they need a certain amount of heat for a number of days before they'll leaf out. You can see if those conditions have been met in your area or if spring is coming for you. We've been on the news a lot recently because there's been really early spring conditions in the eastern United States. In some cases, it's the earliest spring that has been seen in over 40 years. But you can also just explore like what people are reporting on the plants in your area when they're leafing out and how plants in your area are comparing to other places in the United States. So who contributes these data? I kind of showed this a little bit earlier. Whoop, they all came at once. I meant to do that a little at a time. But we have partners all across the United States. And actually, I need to put in the Vermont invasive logo on here because I think that's a really good one to have on here. But we have many organizations all across, and universities and schools all over the United States who collect these phenology data that we're able to learn from. So with that, I just had one other QR code. We have some newsletters, general newsletters for just phenology news, news from the USA NPN. If you have any questions for me, feel free to reach out. My email is samantha@usanpn.org. I'll also be available here to answer any questions that you may have at the end of this presentation as well. But I'll go ahead. I think I'm going to stop sharing now and pass it back to Elizabeth. But thank you all so much for your time. I'll talk to you again soon.
Awesome, thanks. And Rich, if you've got those slides still, I'll take them back, please. And I'd love to tell everyone about the 2 Vermont-specific phenology projects that our program is running.
Yeah, just a second here.
No rush.
And which one did you want to go from?
Let's see, slide 15. Wonderful. Well, thanks so much, Samantha. I do always learn something new every time you present. And I hope this quick dive into Nature's Notebook is getting people excited about getting out in this warmer weather and seeing what's in their backyards and neighborhoods. And as promised, now I'll share the specifics of our community science effort. Our goals within the Vermont Invasive Plant Network include looking to set a science-based standard for on-the-ground efforts and to disseminate current information on these plants to communities, to land managers and scientists, to towns and individuals and beyond. We aim to achieve these goals with the implementation of 2 phenology projects, either of which you can also take part. One is the Vermont Invasive Plant Phenology Project, and the other is the statewide Invasive Plant Phenology Project. And I'll share now their differences and how to get involved. Next slide. So the first phenology project I mentioned, the Vermont Invasive Plant Phenology Project, is a multi-organizational collaboration with sites across the state. And it is a local phenology project, like Sam described, utilizing the National Phenology Network's database and their online mapping tool, Nature's Notebook. I am certified with the National Phenology Network to train volunteers and run this research project, and monitoring takes place almost every week of the year. Participants observe as part of a team and can expect to go out several times a month to collect data. If you are up for contributing regular observations throughout the year, are willing to complete a brief self-paced online training, and you live or travel near one of our study towns of Burlington, Huntington, Castleton, or Danville, please do be in touch. We'd love to have you take part. We started this research project in the spring of 2022. This is a long-term, year-round monitoring project tracking the phenology of 3 invasive species: honeysuckle, buckthorn, and bittersweet. and we look forward to sharing our results in years to come. We are also collaborating with the University of Minnesota, which will be creating climate-based models of invasive plant phenology based on the data that our observers are collecting in Vermont. The format of this project is a status monitoring approach, which Samantha mentioned. So we're interested in collecting positive and negative data, or rather when a plant is or isn't leafed out, flowering, or fruiting. And this allows us to capture things like repeat events, like a second flowering period, and also estimate with more of a degree of certainty the timing of these life stages. Next slide. For the second phenology project, one slide back. Awesome, thank you. The statewide invasive plant phenology project is what birthed many of our ideas for growing this aspect of our work and for starting this network. For the 7th year in a row, the project will continue, tracking any and all invasive plant phenology throughout the state. On the 2nd full week of each month of the growing season, April to October, observers record whatever invasive plant phenology they happen to see and send it to us. We compile that data and send it out to be included in our department's monthly forest health, insect, and disease observation report. This opportunity is less structured and more focused on collecting data on what is happening in the moment, and welcomes anyone who wishes to take part, especially people who are often outside, on the go, and able to recognize some common invasive plants. Participants observe invasive plants during the 2nd full week of each month I mentioned, and you can sign up at any point during the year and can participate as frequently or infrequently as you like. All contributions are appreciated and welcome. So together, we're hoping these two projects paint a more robust picture of invasive plant phenology throughout the state. And we'll use that data to help develop best practices for treatment and deepen our understanding of the way invasive species respond to climate change. Next slide. And we try to make this feel like a collaborative network. We have monthly Zoom open hours where observers can drop in and talk about what they're seeing, ask questions, and enjoy the company of others that are excited about phenology and plants. We also have a podcast available to anyone, which you can stream from vtinvasives.org. Staff have written, recorded, edited, and posted 6 episodes, all focused on the phenology of common invasive plants in Vermont, with 3 more in the works for this year. So if you're enjoying this presentation, then Bud Buds, the podcast, might be for you. It's an occasional, seasonally relevant look at the history, ID, phenology, and management of invasive plants in Vermont, presented as a conversation between 2 friends who like plants, the Bud Buds. The production quality is unassuming, and we hope that style, as well as the conversations, are fun, interesting, and relatable, and might help to answer some questions. Next slide. And here is an example of some preliminary results from the 1st year of our phenology project with the National Phenology Network. As I mentioned, this project uses something called status monitoring. And like I said, we're interested in collecting that positive and negative data over time. We care about recording the status of the plant across time. The results of this project are continuously available for free through the National Phenology Network's online data visualization tool, which Samantha showed us. Pictured here in the darker colors are every time an observer for the project recorded yes for the presence of leaves. On the top row, that's yes, there are leaves for honeysuckle. The middle row is yes, there are leaves for buckthorn. And the bottom row is yes, there are leaves for bittersweet. The lightest color bars, which you can mostly see to the far left and far right, represent an observer recorded no, indicating the absence of leaves. So this status monitoring lets us see the progression in a season leading up to when leaves are present for each species across the state, and also when leaves fall off. And if we look a little closer, we can see that honeysuckle in the top row has an impressive showing of a leaf out last year in early April, followed by buckthorn with leaves making a showing by the end of April, and bittersweet not seeing leaves until well into May. And a similar pattern exists almost in reverse for the fall, with honeysuckle holding onto leaves quite late into the season. Next slide. Oh, back one. Yay, perfect. And here is a comparison of phenophases for just one species, looking at the timing of when leaf buds break. So that's when the leaf buds break from their winter dormancy. And we can see that on the top row. In the middle row is when leaves appear. And then the bottom row is ripe fruit. And these are all phenophases for buckthorn. Recording and looking back at this data, we can see that much of the calendar year is active for invasive species like buckthorn. Next slide. And so for that snapshot data of a whole variety of invasive plant species that's collected through the other project, the statewide Invasive Plant Phenology Monitoring Project, we compile all of our observers' data into write-ups like this that are available monthly in the department's free insect and disease observations reports. And I'll include a link to those at the end of the presentation too. Next slide. So just as a wrap up, there are a few points I hope you take away from today's presentation. Invasive plants are a major forest health concern, and managing for invasive plants, it's multifaceted, it's long-term, it's landscape scale, and it's not a one-off event. There are tons of resources for everyone available on btinvasives.org. And my program is working to incorporate monitoring and science-based data into management of terrestrial invasive plants. And this effort will help all of us by setting a baseline for tracking the eventual range shifts of species within and into the state. We're very excited about providing Vermont-specific phenology data and could use your help. We hope you'll consider taking part and contact us. You can use this QR code for more info. I'll also have the QR code towards the end of the presentation as well. Or you can email us. And that contact information is available on btinvasives.org and on the last slide. All right, next slide. So here's our contact information and that list of resources I mentioned that you might find useful. I'll also make sure that these links are available for our host to share with you all. Great, next slide. And I snuck it in there again for you, Samantha, if you want to do one more sign off.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you guys for having me. And yeah, but please reach out if you guys have any questions about participation or Nature's Notebook questions at all or troubleshooting. Just let me know. I'd be happy to help you all out.
Thank you. Next slide. Okay, so if you'll indulge me, I see we're still under the 8:30 mark. I'd like to leave you on a thoughtful note and bring our discussion back around to perspective and talk briefly about a change in perspective I had as a person whose daily focus is on invasive plants and climate change. So for many years, I kind of felt like Sisyphus, pictured here, toiling away, only to have to take that stone back up the hill again. But a few years ago, I remembered a section of prose, The Star Thrower, by Lauren Isley, American naturalist and writer, where he reflected on a seemingly monumental task. And if you'll indulge me again, I'd like to read briefly from that. So the scene is set at a conference in Costco, along the beach where the tide has gone and thousands of sea stars are laid out on the sand. Isley comes across someone methodically picking up and throwing stars back into the receding waves. I had been unbelieving. I had walked away from the star thrower in the hardened indifference of maturity. On a point of land, as though projecting into a domain beyond us, I found the star thrower. Silently, I sought and picked up a still living star, spinning it far out into the waves. I spoke once briefly. I understand, I said. Call me another thrower. Only then I allowed myself to think, he is not alone any longer. After us, there will be others. We were part of the rainbow, an unexplained projection into the natural. As I went down the beach, I could feel the drawing of a circle in men's minds. It was a visible model of something toward which man's mind had striven, the circle of perfection. I picked and flung another star. I could feel the movement in my body. It was like a sewing, the sewing of life on an infinitely gigantic scale. I looked back across my shoulder, small and dark, against the receding rainbow. The star thrower stooped and flung once more. I never looked again. The task we had assumed was too immense for gazing. I flung and flung again while all about us roared the insatiable waters of death, for it was men as well as starfish that we sought to save. Next slide. And as we tell our volunteers of all ages, this is an all hands on deck process. Thank you for everything you're doing to protect biodiversity in your area. And I hope you leave this talk and this presentation series feeling like there is hope and that you can be part of positive change. So thanks so much for your time. And we'd love to dive into some questions if we still have time left.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Elizabeth. Oh, sorry, Rich.
No, you're fine.
Elizabeth and Samantha, thank you. That was incredible. And so great to learn more about Nature's Notebook. Thank you for walking us through utilizing that. I did go and grab the app, so I'll be looking forward to exploring that more. And yeah, wonderful. So if there are questions, I'm not seeing any in my chat, but if Rich has any, or Elizabeth or Samantha.
Yeah,
if you
well, people can throw them into the chat. We don't have a huge group here, so we can let people unmute themselves as soon as I find that setting.
Great.
So if people just want to shout stuff out, we can do it that way or put them in the chat.
No pressure. Like I said, you know, our, at least for my program, our contact information is on btinvasives.org. So if you have a question that comes up later on, please feel free to reach out to us.
Yeah, we've got one in the chat here now. Is the VIEPC the agency responsible for recommending which species should be quarantined?
Oh, okay. So I believe they are referencing an advisory committee for the Agency of Agriculture, and it is a committee for that makes recommendations for the Agency of Agriculture, and the Agency of Agriculture are the ones responsible for overseeing the noxious weed quarantine. So they're the Agency of Agriculture would be the ones that make that call.
Great. Thank you.
I can totally attest to the Nature's Notebook app working with no cell service, because that is the environment that I work in. And so a little pro tip here, I usually, while I'm still in my house, I'll open up the app, let it do all its thinking fun stuff, and then it's ready to go when I go out into the woods and look at plants. And then when I come home, I can just open it up and hit that sync button and it's all ready to go. It's really remarkable and has reduced so much work from paper data sheets, which I am a staunch advocate for everything paper, but I think I'm a convert here with the mobile app.
All right, and then question about, do you use iNaturalist data?
Oh, so we don't really have a way of like syncing where so. Hold on. Okay, backing up. All the data that gets collected with Nature's Notebook is basically freely accessible to anyone. You could go on our website right now and you could actually download an Excel spreadsheet that has every single piece of data ever collected with Nature's Notebook. When I first started here, I accidentally did that once and it was terrible because it took a few hours and there's like over 30 million records. I don't recommend it, but just so you're aware, it is a possible thing. We have filters where researchers can use that. With that being said, right now, there's not really a way for us to like merge our data with like iNaturalist data or budburst data or anything like that. But one thing we are working on right now is the ability for local phenology programs to be able to add like an iNaturalist. I know they do like kind of like the bioblitzes, but that you could add the Nature's Notebook protocols and phenophase definitions for phenophases they might be looking for. Yeah, I know, right? So that you could do, because right now our program is great for when you have volunteers or when you're regularly collecting data at your home, but iNaturalist is so good for those incidental reports, right? Where it's like, yes, so here's what I'm seeing right here. And so then you could, what the local phenology program leaders can do is put in on their plants, like, by the way, I want this phenology as well, so that you could go into the iNaturalist data and be able to compare it with what's going on with Nature's Notebook. But right now they're not really compatible with using this exact same data collected through both programs. That was a long way of saying that. And also just saying like the programs can go hand in hand as well.
I'm curious myself, really quick, what are the benefits between, or I don't know if benefit is the correct word to use, but what are the differences here between joining a group that's already established or doing your own sort of tag for nutrition?
Absolutely. That's a great question. So like I said, we have like some individuals who are recording their own data. So for example, I'm at an apartment here in Tucson and a lot of people are like, okay, like I get that a lot also, but I have cultivated plants or I had planted plants. Researchers actually do use that data because basically what I did is I created a site, which is all the plants in the courtyard that I want to monitor here. So I monitor some milkweeds that I have in pots in my front porch for our desert refuge project for monarchs and milkweeds in Arizona. And also Tucson Audubon is looking at Lucy's warblers and mesquite trees. So I have my Lucy's warblers nest box out there and my mesquite trees. So I just go outside when I leave in the morning and I do my observations as I'm leaving, but that courtyard is my study site and those plants are the plants I'm monitoring over time. Now that being said, Elizabeth can't come over and she can't, just add data on my plants because it's my personal site. But if I had made it a local phenology program, then Elizabeth could join my group and then she would see my plants and then she could enter the data on those plants. So that's how it would kind of work with the Vermont Invasives is you would join that local phenology program. They would have a map showing you where the plants are because each plant has its own name because you're still following the same ones through time to manage for any individual variation. And then you could, do some training, where are the plants, and then you can collect the data on those plants as well. So your personal site stuff's just for you, But with the local phenology programs, multiple people can come on their own accounts and enter data on the same plants and animals.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah.
And Amy had mentioned that the GBIF can help with data integration, and I think that is what's global biodiversity information, that one.
Yeah, so she mentioned, I know we work with them, but that's another member of our staff that does. So I don't remember exactly how it is that we work with them, but I do know that they're an organization that we at least have worked with before. So I'll ask her. If you want to, the person who asked, I'll put my email in the chat again. You sent me a quick email, by the way, I asked about the GBIF. That'll make sure that I can get that question answered back to you.
And I'll just say again, thank you both so much for joining us. Is there anything, Elizabeth, that you would like to sign off with or throw in?
No, just again, thanks everyone for turning out. I know it was a beautiful evening, and so I hope many others will be enjoying this up on the Friends of Missisquoi National Wildlife Refuge YouTube channel.
Well, if there are no further questions, I think we'll call it a night. Thank you both again so much for joining us. This was so informative and exciting to engage with, and I'm looking forward to hearing more. All right, take care, everyone. Have great evenings and enjoy this nice weather.